Richard Blackwood thought he had solved his problem when he left the crying infant beneath the old oak tree, her tiny fists reaching toward the darkening sky as he walked away without looking back. The wealthy businessman had no idea that Moonlight, his prized Arabian mare, would sense something was terribly wrong that night and break free from her stable. By dawn, forest rangers circling overhead in their helicopter would witness something that would expose the darkest secret of one of the state's most prominent families. But as the white horse stood guard over the abandoned child, one question burned in the morning air. Could an act of pure animal instinct bring justice to an innocent soul that human cruelty had left to die? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The grandfather clock in Richard Blackwood's mahogany-paneled study chimed 11 times, each resonant note echoing through the vast corridors of his estate like a death knell. The sound seemed to mock him as he paced behind his antique desk, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished hardwood floors with the precision of a metronome counting down to his destruction. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, the manicured grounds of his 40-acre property stretched into darkness, punctuated only by the soft glow of security lights that illuminated pathways he had walked in triumph just months before, when his world had been orderly, predictable, and above all, respectable. Richard had built his empire on reputation as much as on shrewd business dealings. Blackwood Industries, the construction company he had inherited from his father and expanded into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, was synonymous with integrity in the competitive world of commercial development. His name graced hospital wings, university buildings, and charity foundations across 3 states. Society pages featured photographs of him and his wife Catherine at galas and fundraising events, the perfect couple representing old money values and philanthropic responsibility. That carefully constructed image, now balanced on the edge of a precipice, threatened by a single indiscretion that had occurred during a business trip to Seattle 8 months earlier. Richard had been negotiating a complex deal involving the redevelopment of an abandoned industrial district when he met Marina Santos, a young architect working for the city planning department. She was brilliant, passionate about urban renewal, and 23 years younger than his 52 years. The affair had lasted only 3 weeks, a whirlwind of clandestine meetings in expensive hotel rooms and intimate dinners at restaurants, far from anyone who might recognize him. Richard had convinced himself it was nothing more than a brief escape from the suffocating expectations of his public life, a temporary lapse in judgment that would fade into memory once he returned to Connecticut and his well-ordered existence. But Marina had called him 6 weeks later with news that shattered his complacency like a sledgehammer through crystal. She was pregnant, and despite his immediate offers of financial support for any solution she might choose, she was determined to have the child. More dangerously, she spoke of love, of the connection she believed they had shared, of her hope that he might leave his wife and build a life with her and their baby. Richard had spent the following months in a state of controlled panic, managing the situation with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to hostile corporate takeovers. He provided Marina with a generous monthly allowance, arranged for the best prenatal care, and maintained regular contact while carefully avoiding any promises about their future together. He told himself he was being responsible, handling a difficult situation with maturity and discretion. The baby had been born 3 days ago, a perfect little girl with Marina's dark eyes and what appeared to be Richard's stubborn chin. Marina had sent him photographs and a birth certificate listing him as the father, along with a letter expressing her love for both him and their daughter, whom she had named Sofia. She wrote about her dreams of raising their child together, of introducing Richard to her family, of building the kind of authentic relationship that his marriage had never provided. Reading that letter in his study, while Catherine worked in her garden just outside his window, Richard had felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in around him. The child represented more than just an embarrassing secret. She was a living threat to everything he had spent his lifetime building. His marriage to Catherine, while not passionate, was built on mutual respect and shared social standing. She came from an equally prominent family, and their union had been more merger than romance, combining 2 industrial fortunes and creating a social powerhouse that had dominated Connecticut society for nearly 3 decades. A divorce would be catastrophic, financially, socially, and professionally. Catherine's family controlled significant portions of his business partnerships, and her father sat on the boards of several major corporations that provided lucrative contracts to Blackwood Industries. More importantly, Catherine was beloved by the social elite who formed his customer base, respected for her charitable work, and admired for her grace under pressure. If she were to divorce him, especially over an affair that had produced an illegitimate child, Richard would find himself persona non grata in the circles where his business thrived. The solution had come to him during a sleepless night, 3 days after Sofia's birth, a plan so coldly calculated that even he was surprised by his own capacity for ruthlessness. Marina was planning to bring the baby to Connecticut, hoping to force some kind of confrontation that would compel him to acknowledge his daughter publicly. She had booked a flight for the following week and had already researched the address of his estate, intending to present herself at his door with their child in her arms. Richard could not allow that to happen. Instead, he had flown to Seattle under the pretense of business, arranged to meet Marina at her apartment, and convinced her to let him take the baby for a drive while she packed for their trip. It had been surprisingly easy to manipulate her emotions, to play on her desperate hope that he was finally ready to embrace his role as a father. She had dressed little Sofia in her best outfit, a pink dress with tiny white flowers that Marina's mother had sewn by hand, and had kissed both Richard and the baby goodbye with tears of joy in her eyes. Now, 6 hours later, Richard stood in his study, with the child sleeping in a portable car seat beside his desk, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of innocent sleep. She was beautiful in the way that all babies were, with perfect miniature features and an expression of absolute trust that made something twist painfully in Richard's chest. For a moment, holding her tiny hand as she slept in his Mercedes during the drive from the airport, he had almost weakened, almost convinced himself that he could find another way to handle the situation. But the moment had passed, overwhelmed by the weight of everything he stood to lose. Richard was not a man accustomed to accepting defeat, and he refused to allow one moment of weakness to destroy everything he had worked to achieve. The plan he had developed was both simple and foolproof, designed to eliminate the problem permanently while providing him with plausible deniability if any questions were ever raised. The Blackwood estate bordered thousands of acres of state forest land, dense woodlands that stretched for miles without any human habitation. Wild animals were common in the area: black bears, coyotes, and other predators that would ensure no trace of evidence remained. Richard had identified the perfect location during his morning rides, a secluded clearing nearly a mile from the nearest trail, accessible only by an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. He picked up the car seat, surprised by how light it felt, and walked through his house to the kitchen, where he had left a bottle of formula warming in a pot of water. The baby stirred as he fed her, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb with surprising strength. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that reminded him so painfully of Marina, and for a moment Richard felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the wall of ice he had built around his emotions. But he forced himself to remember what was at stake. Catherine was upstairs in their bedroom, reading before sleep as she did every night, trusting him completely and unaware that her husband was about to commit an act that would haunt his dreams for whatever remained of his life. His business empire, built over 3 generations, employed thousands of people whose livelihoods depended on his continued success and reputation. One child, however innocent, could not be allowed to destroy so many lives. Richard waited until after midnight, when the house was completely still and Catherine's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. He dressed in dark clothing, old jeans, and a black sweater that he could dispose of afterward, and quietly carried the car seat through the kitchen to the mudroom where he kept his outdoor deer. The baby had fallen asleep again after her feeding, her tiny fist pressed against her cheek in an expression of perfect contentment. The walk through the woods felt endless, each step taking him further from any possibility of redemption. Richard had brought a small flashlight, but he kept it pointed at the ground to avoid being seen from his house or any of the neighboring properties. The old logging road was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and littered with fallen branches that caught at his feet and threatened to trip him with every step. The clearing, when he finally reached it, looked exactly as he remembered from his scouting trips. A small open space, surrounded by towering oak and maple trees, carpeted with fallen leaves and ferns that grew in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy during daylight hours. Now, in the darkness before dawn, it felt like a natural cathedral, ancient and primeval, and completely isolated from the civilized world. Richard set the car seat down beneath the largest oak tree, a massive specimen that must have been growing in this spot for centuries. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake, her breathing steady and peaceful in the cool night air. He had brought a blanket, telling himself it was to keep her comfortable, but now he realized it was more about assuaging his own conscience than providing any real protection from what was to come. Standing over the sleeping child, Richard felt the full weight of what he was about to do crash down on him like a physical blow. This tiny, perfect human being had never done anything wrong, had never asked to be born into such a complicated situation, had never deserved the cold calculation that had brought her to this moment. She was his daughter, carrying his DNA, inheriting his stubborn chin, and probably his fierce determination. And he was about to condemn her to a death that would be neither quick nor merciful. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Richard stood frozen between his old life and the unthinkable act that would preserve it. He could still turn back, could scoop up the car seat and return to his house, could find another way to handle Marina and the complications that Sofia's existence would create. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he rejected it, his businessman's pragmatism overriding the faint stirrings of paternal instinct. He turned and walked away without looking back, each step requiring tremendous force of will, as some primitive part of his brain screamed at him to return to the helpless infant he was abandoning. The walk back to his house passed in a blur of self-loathing and desperate rationalization, his mind already working on the story he would tell Marina when she called looking for news of their daughter. By the time Richard reached his estate, he had convinced himself that he had chosen the lesser of several evils, that preserving his marriage and business empire served a greater good than saving one child who would have grown up without a father anyway. He told himself that Marina was young and resilient, that she would recover from this tragedy and eventually build a better life than anything he could have offered her as a kept woman living in the shadows of his public existence. But as he stood in his shower, washing away any traces of his midnight journey, Richard discovered that conscience was not so easily silenced. The image of Sofia's sleeping face haunted him, and he found himself straining to listen for sounds from the forest, part of him hoping irrationally that his crime would be discovered and he would be forced to face the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, in the stables behind the main house, Moonlight was experiencing her own form of restlessness. The white Arabian mare had been Richard's pride for nearly 8 years. A magnificent animal with an intelligence and sensitivity that made her seem almost human at times. She'd been bred for both beauty and performance, with bloodlines that traced back to the finest racing stock in the Middle East, and Richard had spared no expense in providing her with the best care and training available. Tonight, however, something was disturbing Moonlight's usual calm demeanor. She paced in her stall, whinnying softly and tossing her head in obvious agitation. The other horses in the stable seemed to sense her distress, shifting restlessly in their own stalls and responding to her calls with nervous whickers of their own. Carlos Martinez, the estate's head groom, had checked on the horses before retiring to his apartment above the stable office, and everything had seemed normal at that time. Moonlight had accepted her evening grooming and feeding without any sign of distress, and Carlos had assumed she would settle down for the night as she always did. But something was calling to her from beyond the confines of her comfortable stall, some instinct or awareness that humans couldn't understand, but that demanded action. At 3:30 in the morning, Moonlight made her decision. The stall door, which Carlos thought he had secured properly, gave way under her determined pushing, the metal latch sliding open with a soft click that was immediately swallowed by the larger sounds of the night. The stable door presented a greater challenge, but Moonlight was both intelligent and persistent, working at the handle with her muzzle until it too surrendered to her efforts. Once free, the mare moved with purpose rather than the random wandering that might be expected from an escaped horse. She trotted across the manicured grounds of the estate, her white coat ghostly in the dim security lighting, and headed directly toward the tree line where the property bordered the state forest. Something was pulling her forward, some scent or sound or electromagnetic signal that her equine senses could detect, but that would have been imperceptible to human awareness. The old logging road posed no obstacle to an animal that had been born to navigate rough terrain, and Moonlight moved through the forest with the confidence of a creature perfectly adapted to wilderness travel. Her hooves found secure footing on the uneven ground, and her eyes, far better adapted to darkness than human vision, allowed her to avoid the obstacles that had slowed Richard's progress hours earlier. The scent reached her when she was still several hundred yards from the clearing, a complex mixture of human baby, fear, abandonment, and helplessness that triggered every protective instinct in her powerful body. Moonlight broke into a gallop, crashing through the underbrush with an urgency that sent smaller forest creatures scurrying for cover, and announced her approach with a sound like approaching thunder. She found Sofia, exactly where Richard had left her, still sleeping peacefully in her car seat beneath the ancient oak tree, apparently unaware that she had been condemned to die alone in the wilderness. But even as Moonlight approached, other sounds were beginning to penetrate the forest quiet, the calls of coyotes in the distance, and the rustle of larger predators moving through the underbrush in response to the scent of helpless prey. Without hesitation, Moonlight positioned herself between the sleeping baby and the approaching threats, her body forming a protective barrier that would have to be overcome before any predator could reach the child. She lowered herself to the ground in a position that horses rarely adopted outside of their most comfortable and secure environments, curling her powerful body around the car seat in a gesture that was both defensive and nurturing. The mare's presence had an immediate effect on the forest around them. The coyote calls faded as the pack moved away in search of easier prey, unwilling to challenge an animal of Moonlight's size and obvious determination. Other night hunters, reading the signals that proclaimed this territory temporarily claimed and defended, altered their routes and sought their meals elsewhere. As the hours passed and dawn approached, Moonlight maintained her vigil with the patience and dedication of a mother protecting her foal. She dozed fitfully, always alert for any sound that might signal approaching danger, and several times she rose to her feet to investigate rustling in the nearby bushes that proved to be nothing more threatening than raccoons or rabbits going about their nocturnal business. Sofia slept through most of the night, occasionally stirring and making soft baby sounds that seemed to reassure Moonlight that her tiny charge was still alive and well. When the baby did wake, crying with hunger and discomfort, the mare responded by nuzzling her gently and making soft whickering sounds that seemed to provide some comfort, though she could do nothing about the infant's basic needs for food and warmth. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the forest canopy, painting the clearing in shades of gold and green, Moonlight's vigil was about to be rewarded in a way that neither she nor the sleeping baby could have anticipated. The regular morning patrol helicopter from the State Forest Service was beginning its daily sweep of the protected lands, watching for signs of illegal camping, poaching, or other human activities that might threaten the ecological balance of the preserve. Ranger Captain David Chen was piloting the helicopter that morning, accompanied by his partner Sarah Williams, both of them experienced in spotting unusual activities from their aerial vantage point. They had been patrolling these forests for over a decade and prided themselves on their ability to detect even subtle signs of human intrusion or animal distress. It was Sarah who first spotted the flash of white in the clearing below, an anomaly that immediately caught her attention, because horses were not native to this part of the forest, and certainly shouldn't be found this far from any human habitation. She pointed out the sighting to David, who banked the helicopter for a closer look at what appeared to be a large white horse, lying in an unusually protective posture. "That's definitely a domestic horse," David said through the headset, his voice tight with concern. "Arabian, by the look of her, and she's acting like she's protecting something. Can you see what's underneath her?" Sarah adjusted her binoculars and felt her heart stop as the details became clear. "David, there's a baby down there, a human baby in some kind of carrier. The horse is literally guarding her." The implications hit both rangers simultaneously. A domestic horse protecting a human infant in the middle of thousands of acres of wilderness could only mean one thing. Someone had abandoned that child to die, and somehow the horse had found her and taken on the role of protector through what must have been a terrifying night. David immediately radioed their headquarters, requesting backup units and emergency medical services, while Sarah continued to monitor the scene below. As their helicopter circled overhead, Moonlight looked up at them with obvious intelligence in her dark eyes, as if she understood that help had finally arrived and her vigil was nearly over. "The horse knows we're here," Sarah reported. "She's not spooked by the helicopter at all. It's almost like she's been waiting for us." Within minutes, the clearing was swarming with activity as Forest Service rangers, emergency medical technicians, and sheriff's deputies converged on the scene from multiple directions. Moonlight allowed them to approach without resistance, stepping aside only when it became clear that the humans were there to help rather than harm the child she had protected through the night. Sofia was dehydrated and hungry, but otherwise unharmed. Her vital signs strong, and her responses normal for an infant of her age. The EMTs worked quickly to stabilize her condition, while investigators began the process of trying to determine how a newborn baby had ended up abandoned in one of the most remote sections of the state forest. The car seat provided the first clue, an expensive model that was sold only at upscale baby stores, suggesting that whoever had abandoned the child had significant financial resources. The pink dress Sofia was wearing was clearly handmade, with embroidered details that spoke of loving care and attention. Most importantly, there were no signs of violence or abuse, indicating that the abandonment was a calculated decision rather than the result of a crime of passion or desperation. Meanwhile, Moonlight's presence provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. The mare was clearly well cared for and expensively bred, with a demeanor that suggested extensive training and handling by experienced horsemen. Her lack of fear around humans and her protective behavior toward the baby indicated a level of intelligence and emotional development that was rare even among horses. Sheriff's investigator Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez took charge of the case, immediately recognizing that they were dealing with something far more complex than a typical abandonment situation. The logistics of getting an infant to such a remote location suggested careful planning and local knowledge, while the horse's involvement indicated a connection to one of the wealthy estates that bordered the forest. "Preserve. We need to identify this horse," Rodriguez told her team as they processed the scene. "An animal this well-bred doesn't just wander into the woods by accident. Someone's missing a very expensive mare, and I'm betting that someone knows exactly how this baby ended up out here." The investigation moved quickly once they began canvassing the nearby estates. Moonlight's distinctive appearance and obvious quality made her easy to identify, and it took less than 4 hours for investigators to trace her back to the Blackwood property. The fact that Richard Blackwood was one of the state's most prominent citizens only added urgency to an already high-priority case. When the sheriff's vehicles pulled up the circular drive to the Blackwood mansion, Richard was in his study pretending to work while actually staring out the window toward the forest where he had committed his crime less than 12 hours earlier. He had spent the morning in a state of nervous tension, jumping at every sound and constantly checking news websites for any reports of unusual activity in the area. The sight of uniformed officers approaching his front door sent a jolt of panic through his system, but Richard forced himself to remain calm as he walked to greet them. His years of high-stakes business negotiations had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, and he drew on that experience now as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. Lieutenant Rodriguez introduced herself and her team, explaining that they were investigating the discovery of an abandoned infant in the nearby forest and that they had traced an involved horse back to his property. She watched Richard's face carefully as she spoke, noting the subtle changes in his expression that suggested guilty knowledge despite his attempts to appear surprised and concerned. "An abandoned baby?" Richard managed, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "That's terrible. How can I help with your investigation?" "We're hoping you can help us understand how your horse ended up in the forest last night," Rodriguez replied, her tone carefully neutral. "According to your stable manager, Moonlight escaped from her stall sometime after midnight and wasn't discovered missing until this morning. We found her protecting the abandoned infant, apparently having stood guard over the child all night." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that his perfect crime had been unraveled by the very horse he had raised and trained for nearly a decade. Moonlight had not only survived his attempt to distance himself from the scene, but had actually become the key witness to his guilt. "I had no idea she was missing," he said, which was technically true, since he had been careful not to check on the horses after returning from his midnight journey. "She's never escaped before. This is very unlike her." "The thing is, Mr. Blackwood," Rodriguez continued, studying his face intently, "Moonlight didn't just wander randomly through the forest. She went directly to where the baby had been left, almost like she knew exactly where to find her. That suggests a connection between your property and the abandonment site that we need to understand." Richard could feel the walls closing in around him, but he maintained his facade of innocent cooperation, even as his mind raced through possible escape routes. "I'm afraid I can't explain the horse's behavior," he said. "Perhaps she heard something, a sound that drew her attention. Horses have much better hearing than we do." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Rodriguez and her team asking increasingly specific questions about Richard's activities the previous evening, his familiarity with the forest trails, and his knowledge of anyone who might have had reason to abandon a child in the area. Throughout the interrogation, Richard maintained his story of ignorance and concern, but the experienced investigators could sense the deception underlying his words. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez mentioned that they had found what appeared to be recent tire tracks on the old logging road, suggesting that someone had driven partway into the forest before continuing on foot. The tracks appeared to match the tread pattern of luxury sedan tires, and forensic experts were already working to identify the specific make and model. Richard's face went pale at this information, though he tried to cover his reaction by expressing shock and dismay that someone would go to such lengths to abandon a helpless child. But Rodriguez had seen enough guilty suspects to recognize the signs, and she made a mental note to obtain a warrant to search Richard's vehicles for evidence that might connect him to the crime scene. As the officers prepared to leave, Rodriguez played her final card, a gambit designed to gauge Richard's reaction to information that only the perpetrator would find personally threatening. "There's one more thing you should know," she said, watching his face carefully. "The baby was wearing a dress with hand-embroidered flowers when we found her. Beautiful work. The kind of detail you see in clothing made by someone who really loves the child. We're hoping that might help us identify her." Family. Richard felt his heart stop as he realized that Marina's mother's handiwork might provide another avenue for investigators to trace Sofia back to her origins. The dress, which had seemed like such a touching detail when Marina had shown it to him with pride, now represented another thread that could unravel his carefully constructed alibi. "That's fortunate," he managed to say, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "I hope you're able to find the people responsible for such a terrible act." After the officers left, Richard retreated to his study and poured himself a double scotch, with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the crystal decanter. Everything was falling apart, despite his careful planning and ruthless execution of what should have been the perfect crime. Moonlight's intervention had not only saved Sofia's life, but had created a direct connection between the abandonment site and his own property that would be impossible to explain away. Worse still, he knew that Marina would soon realize something was wrong when he failed to return Sofia to her as promised. She would call, demanding to know where her daughter was, and when he couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation, she would almost certainly contact the authorities herself. The investigation that was already focusing on him would intensify, and eventually, the truth would emerge. Richard spent the next several hours in his study, alternately pacing and sitting behind his desk while his mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios for escape. He could claim that someone had stolen the baby from his car, but the logistics of that story didn't make sense given the timeline and location. He could try to implicate Marina herself, suggesting that she had followed him to Connecticut and abandoned the child in a desperate attempt to force his hand. But that explanation would require him to admit to the affair and acknowledge his paternity. As afternoon faded into evening, Richard's phone began ringing with calls from reporters who had somehow learned of his connection to the abandoned baby story. The local news stations were already running stories about the mysterious infant found in the forest and the heroic horse who had protected her through the night. And it was only a matter of time before Richard's name would be connected to the investigation. The end came faster than Richard had anticipated. By 8 o'clock that evening, forensic experts had matched the tire tracks from the logging road to his Mercedes, and Marina had contacted Seattle police to report that Richard Blackwood had taken their daughter and disappeared, quote, Phone records confirmed that he had been in contact with Marina regularly throughout her pregnancy, and bank records showed the monthly payments he had been making to support her. When Lieutenant Rodriguez returned to the Blackwood estate with an arrest warrant, she found Richard sitting in his study with an empty scotch glass, staring out the window toward the forest where his daughter had nearly died because of his selfish cruelty. He offered no resistance as the handcuffs were applied, and his only request was to see Moonlight one more time before being taken into custody. The reunion in the stable was brief, but profound. Moonlight approached Richard with her usual calm intelligence, but there was something different in her eyes, awareness that seemed to judge him for his actions and find him wanting. When he reached out to stroke her neck, as he had done thousands of times before, she pulled away from his touch, a rejection that cut deeper than any legal punishment he might face. "She knows," Richard whispered, to no one in particular as the officers led him away. "She knows what I did." The media frenzy that followed Richard's arrest was everything he had feared, and more. The story of the wealthy businessman who had abandoned his own child to die in the wilderness, only to be exposed by his own horse, captured public attention in a way that few criminal cases ever did. Cable news networks ran the story continuously, complete with aerial footage of the forest clearing where Sofia had been found, and interviews with the rangers who had discovered her. Moonlight became a celebrity in her own right, hailed as a hero whose instincts and loyalty had saved an innocent life. Animal behaviorists appeared on television to discuss the remarkable intelligence and empathy that horses could display, while child welfare advocates used the case to highlight the vulnerability of infants and the importance of support systems for unmarried mothers. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, with Richard's high-powered attorneys unable to construct any credible defense against the overwhelming physical evidence and witness testimony. The tire tracks, the phone records, the financial payments to Marina, and most damning of all, the undeniable fact that his own horse had led investigators directly to the scene of his crime, created a case that was impossible to dispute. Richard ultimately pleaded guilty to charges of child endangerment and attempted murder, accepting a sentence of 15 to 25 years in prison, rather than face the possibility of life imprisonment if convicted at trial. His business empire collapsed as corporate partners distanced themselves from the scandal, and Catherine filed for divorce within weeks of his arrest, taking half of his remaining assets and returning to her family's estate in shame and disgust. Marina flew to Connecticut to reclaim her daughter and testify at Richard's sentencing hearing, where she spoke movingly about the love she felt for Sofia and the horror she had experienced upon learning how close she had come to losing her child forever. She had initially considered pressing for the maximum possible sentence, but ultimately asked the court for mercy, saying that she wanted her daughter to grow up knowing that forgiveness was possible, even in the face of unforgivable acts. Sofia, now healthy and thriving in her mother's care, would grow up knowing the story of how a magnificent white horse had saved her life, when the man who should have protected her had instead chosen to sacrifice her for his own selfish interests. The tale would become part of her personal mythology, a reminder that heroes could come in unexpected forms, and that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion and loyalty could still triumph over cruelty and abandonment. Moonlight remained at the estate until it was sold to pay Richard's legal debts and court-ordered restitution to Marina and Sofia. The mare was eventually purchased by a therapeutic riding program that specialized in helping children with disabilities, where her gentle nature and obvious intelligence made her perfectly suited to providing comfort and healing to young people who had faced their own challenges and traumas. The old oak tree in the forest clearing became an unofficial memorial, visited by hikers and nature lovers who had been moved by the story of the abandoned baby and her unlikely protector. Someone had carved a small plaque into the bark, reading simply, "Sofia's tree where love conquered cruelty," and visitors often left flowers or small toys as tributes to the child who had survived and the horse who had made her survival possible. Years later, when Sofia was old enough to understand the full story of her early life, Marina would bring her to visit the clearing where she had nearly died and the stable where Moonlight had lived. The visits were difficult, but important. Part of helping Sofia understand that she had been born into a complicated situation, but had always been loved, even when that love came from an unexpected source. The story of Richard Blackwood and the White Horse became a modern parable about the consequences of putting reputation above responsibility, wealth above humanity, and convenience above conscience. It served as a reminder that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond our ability to predict or control them, and that sometimes the very measures we take to protect ourselves become the instruments of our own destruction. In the end, Richard's attempt to preserve his perfect life by sacrificing his innocent daughter had accomplished exactly the opposite of what he intended. Instead of protecting his reputation, he had destroyed it completely. Instead of preserving his marriage and business empire, he had lost both, along with his freedom. Instead of eliminating the evidence of his indiscretion, he had created a story that would be remembered long after his name might otherwise have been forgotten. But perhaps most importantly, his cold calculation had been defeated by the warm instincts of a horse who understood, in ways that he apparently could not, that some things in life were more important than self-preservation. Moonlight's decision to break free from her comfortable stable and venture into the dangerous forest to protect a helpless child had demonstrated a kind of moral courage that Richard, for all his wealth and education and social standing, had proven incapable of displaying when faced with his own moment of choice. The White Horse had done more than save Sofia's life. That night in the forest, she had restored faith in the possibility that good could triumph over evil, that innocence could be protected, even when those who should provide protection failed in their duty, and that sometimes the most profound acts of heroism came from the most unexpected sources. In a world that often seemed dominated by selfishness and cruelty, Moonlight's vigil beneath the oak tree had provided proof that compassion and loyalty were still forces powerful enough to change the course of destiny itself. As the months following Richard's imprisonment passed, the reverberations of his crime continued to spread through multiple lives in ways that no one could have anticipated. Marina Santos had returned to Seattle with Sofia, but the trauma of nearly losing her daughter had fundamentally changed her perspective on life and trust. She found herself unable to sleep through the night without checking on Sofia multiple times, and every news report about child endangerment sent waves of anxiety through her system that required months of therapy to address. The generous settlement that Richard's lawyers had negotiated as part of his plea agreement provided Marina with financial security she had never known. But it came with the bitter knowledge that the money represented compensation for her daughter's near-death experience. She used a portion of the funds to establish the Sofia Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting single mothers and preventing child abandonment through counseling services and emergency baby assistance programs. Marina's work with the foundation brought her into contact with dozens of women who had faced similar pressures to abandon or harm their children, and she began to understand that Richard's crime, while particularly calculated and cruel, was part of a larger pattern of how society failed to support vulnerable mothers and children. Many of the women she counseled had been abandoned by wealthy men who saw pregnancy as an inconvenience to be eliminated, rather than a responsibility to be embraced. Through her advocacy work, Marina became a prominent voice in the movement to reform laws regarding parental responsibility and child support, testifying before state legislatures about the need for stronger enforcement mechanisms and harsher penalties for parents who abandoned their children. Her articulate presentations, combined with the compelling story of Sofia's survival, helped push through several important pieces of legislation that strengthened protections for children and support systems for single mothers. Meanwhile, Sofia herself was growing into a remarkably resilient and intelligent child, showing signs of inheriting both her mother's architectural brilliance and what Marina reluctantly acknowledged might be her father's business acumen. By the age of 3, Sofia displayed an unusual affinity for animals, particularly horses, though Marina was careful to ensure that her daughter's interest was nurtured in healthy environments, far removed from any connection to her traumatic origins. The therapeutic benefits of Sofia's interaction with horses became apparent during visits to the riding program where Moonlight now lived. The white mare seemed to recognize something special in the little girl, displaying a gentleness and patience that the program instructors had rarely seen even in their most experienced therapy horses. Sofia would spend hours brushing Moonlight's coat and talking to her in the mixture of English and Spanish, that had become her preferred mode of communication. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, who ran the therapeutic writing program, began documenting the remarkable bond between Sofia and Moonlight. Noting that the child's presence seemed to have a calming effect on the horse, then extended to her work with other children in the program. The relationship appeared to be mutually beneficial, with Sofia gaining confidence and emotional stability from her time with Moonlight, while the mare seemed to find renewed purpose in her role as a therapy animal. "It's almost as if they both understand that they share something profound," Dr. Harper explained to Marina during one of their regular conferences about Sofia's progress. "The horse saved her life, and now she's giving the horse's life new meaning. It's one of the most beautiful examples of interspecies bonding I've ever witnessed." The story of Sofia and Moonlight's ongoing relationship attracted attention from animal behaviorists and child psychologists across the country, leading to several research studies about the therapeutic benefits of connecting trauma survivors with the animals that had helped them. The findings suggested that such relationships could accelerate healing and provide unique forms of emotional support that traditional therapy alone couldn't match. Back in Connecticut, the aftermath of Richard's crimes continued to unfold in ways that affected entire communities. The Blackwood estate, once a symbol of prosperity and social prominence, stood empty for nearly 2 years as legal proceedings determined how the property should be disposed of to satisfy court judgments and creditor claims. The magnificent grounds that had once hosted charity galas and society events grew wild and overgrown, creating an eerie monument to the consequences of moral failure. Catherine Blackwood, now Catherine Morrison after reclaiming her maiden name, had initially retreated from public life in shame and horror at her husband's actions. But as the shock wore off, she began to channel her anger and disgust into constructive action. Using her own family fortune and the social connections that remained loyal to her, Catherine established a network of safe houses and support services for women facing pressure to abandon or harm their children. The Catherine Morrison Foundation became one of the most effective organizations in the region for preventing child abandonment, providing everything from emergency housing and medical care to legal advocacy and job training for women in crisis. Catherine threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had once devoted to charity galas, but now, with a personal understanding of how quickly lives could be destroyed by the selfish actions of those who should provide protection and support. "I lived with a monster for nearly 30 years without recognizing what he was capable of," Catherine told a gathering of Foundation supporters during their first annual fundraising dinner. "If I can help even one child avoid the fate that Richard planned for his own daughter, then perhaps some good can come from this terrible situation." The Foundation's work attracted national attention when it successfully prevented several high-profile abandonment cases, including one involving a prominent politician who had been pressuring his mistress to give up their child for adoption to protect his career. The Foundation's legal team had intervened to ensure that the woman received the support she needed to keep her child, while also pursuing criminal charges against the politician for attempted coercion. Meanwhile, the investigation into Richard's crime had revealed a pattern of similar behavior among wealthy men who viewed illegitimate children as threats to be eliminated rather than responsibilities to be embraced. Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, who had led the initial investigation, found herself at the center of a multi-state task force examining abandoned child cases that might involve similar perpetrators. The task force discovered that Richard's case was not unique, that there was a disturbing trend of affluent men abandoning children in remote locations, with the expectation that natural predators would eliminate the evidence of their indiscretions. The investigators found connections between several unsolved cases and wealthy suspects who had used their resources and influence to avoid scrutiny for their crimes. Rodriguez's work on these cases earned her national recognition and eventually led to her appointment as director of a new federal task force focused on crimes against children committed by individuals in positions of power and influence. The Richard Blackwood case became a template for investigating similar crimes, with the involvement of domestic animals often providing crucial evidence that connected suspects to remote crime scenes. What Richard Blackwood didn't understand, Rodriguez explained during a presentation at a national law enforcement conference, is that animals don't lie, and they don't make deals to protect themselves. When Moonlight led us directly to that clearing, She provided testimony that no human witness could have given. Animals see through our deceptions and respond to our actions rather than our words. The legal precedents established by Richard's case also led to significant changes in how abandonment cases were prosecuted and prevented. Several states passed legislation requiring mandatory reporting of suspicious animal behavior that might indicate human crimes. And veterinarians and animal care professionals received training in recognizing signs that domestic animals might have been witnesses to or victims of human criminal activity. The therapeutic riding program where Moonlight lived became a model for similar facilities across the country, with Dr. Harper regularly consulting with other programs about how to maximize the healing potential of human-animal interactions. The program expanded significantly, using donations from people who had been moved by Sofia's story to serve many more children and adults who had experienced trauma. Moonlight herself seemed to understand her role as both a therapy animal and a symbol of hope for survivors of abandonment and abuse. She worked with children who had been neglected or abused by their parents, with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress, and with elderly patients in nursing homes who found comfort in her gentle presence. Each interaction seemed to reinforce her understanding that she had an important purpose beyond her original role as a show horse. The program began offering special sessions for families dealing with adoption and foster care situations, with Moonlight providing a calming presence that helped children and parents bond during difficult transitions. Her story gave hope to adoptive families who were helping children overcome early trauma, demonstrating that healing was possible even after the most severe betrayals of trust. As Sofia grew older and began asking more detailed questions about her early life, Marina faced the challenge of explaining her father's actions in age-appropriate ways that wouldn't traumatize her daughter, but would help her understand the importance of the choices that adults make. The conversations were difficult, but they were made easier by Sofia's ongoing relationship with Moonlight, which provided a concrete example of how love and protection could triumph over abandonment and cruelty. "Moonlight is your guardian angel," Marina would tell Sofia during their visits to the therapeutic riding program. "When your father made a very bad choice, she made a very good choice. She showed you that there will always be someone who cares about you, even when it seems like you're all alone." These conversations helped Sofia develop a sophisticated understanding of moral complexity that was remarkable for her age. She seemed to grasp intuitively that people could make both good and bad choices, and that the consequences of those choices extended far beyond the person making them. Her teachers noted that she displayed unusual empathy for classmates who were struggling with family problems, often offering comfort and support that seemed wise beyond her years. The bond between Sofia and Moonlight also attracted attention from documentary filmmakers and journalists who wanted to explore the ongoing story of their relationship. A major television network produced a follow-up special 5 years after the original rescue, showing how both Sofia and Moonlight had thrived in the aftermath of the traumatic events that had brought them together. The documentary revealed that Sofia had begun competing in equestrian events, with Moonlight serving as her primary training horse despite the mare's advanced age. The partnership between the child and the horse who had saved her life created emotionally powerful performances that consistently impressed judges and audiences. Though Marina was careful to ensure that the competitions remained focused on Sofia's development rather than media attention. "When I watch them together," Dr. Harper commented during the documentary, "I see something that goes beyond normal human-animal bonding. They understand each other on a level that speaks to some deeper connection, something that was forged during those hours when Moonlight stood guard over a helpless infant in the darkness of the forest." The therapeutic riding program began receiving visitors from around the world who wanted to study the unique relationship between Sofia and Moonlight, leading to international research collaborations and exchanges that advanced understanding of animal-assisted therapy techniques. The program became a training center for professionals working with trauma survivors, with Moonlight serving as a living example of how animals could provide healing in ways that humans alone could not achieve. Richard himself remained largely isolated in prison, serving his sentence in a medium-security facility where his former wealth and status provided no protection from the reality of his crimes. Fellow inmates, many of whom were fathers themselves, showed little sympathy for a man who had abandoned his own child to die. and Richard found himself at the bottom of the prison hierarchy, despite his educational background and former social prominence. The prison chaplain, Father Michael O'Connor, made repeated attempts to counsel Richard about redemption and forgiveness, but the former businessman seemed unable to move beyond his anger at being caught and punished for what he still regarded as a reasonable response to an impossible situation. His letters to the parole board consistently demonstrated more self-pity than genuine remorse, focusing on the hardships of prison life rather than acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. He talks about the loss of his business and his reputation, Father O'Connor noted in his reports to the parole board. But he never mentions his daughter, except as the cause of his problems. There's no indication that he understands the gravity of what he attempted to do or feels genuine remorse for nearly causing the death of his own child. Richard's lack of genuine remorse became a significant factor in the parole board's decisions to deny his early release applications. His lawyer argued that he had been a model prisoner who posed no threat to society, but the board consistently concluded that someone who showed no understanding of the enormity of his crime could not be trusted not to commit similar acts if released early. The denials of parole attracted media attention that kept Richard's story in the public consciousness, serving as a reminder that wealth and privilege could not protect someone from the consequences of moral failure. Each parole hearing became an opportunity for Marina to provide victim impact statements that eloquently described the ongoing effects of Richard's crime on her and Sofia's lives. "My daughter still has nightmares sometimes," Marina testified during one hearing. "She dreams about being lost and alone in dark places. The trauma of nearly losing her life because her own father valued his reputation more than her existence will be something we deal with for the rest of our lives. The idea that he might be released early, without showing any real understanding of what he did wrong, is terrifying to us." These statements, combined with letters of support from child advocacy organizations and the continued public interest in Sofia's story, created a powerful coalition opposing Richard's early release. The parole board faced enormous public pressure to keep him incarcerated for the full term of his sentence, and perhaps beyond if he continued to show no signs of genuine rehabilitation. As Sofia approached her 10th birthday, she began expressing interest in meeting her father, not out of any desire for a relationship, but from curiosity about the man whose actions had shaped the early years of her life in such dramatic ways. Marina initially resisted the idea, fearing that contact with Richard might be traumatic or confusing for Sofia. But child psychologists suggested that a carefully supervised meeting might actually help Sofia process her feelings about her origins. The meeting was arranged through the prison chaplain, with strict conditions about the topics that could be discussed, and the presence of trained counselors to support Sofia if she became upset. Marina accompanied her daughter to the prison, her own emotions carefully controlled as she prepared to face the man who had nearly cost her everything she held dear. Richard, now graying and diminished by years of incarceration, seemed genuinely shocked by Sofia's appearance when she entered the visiting room. She had grown into a beautiful child who resembled both her parents. With Marina's dark eyes and intelligent expression, combined with Richard's determined jaw and confident bearing. For the first time since his arrest, Richard seemed to confront the reality of what he had nearly destroyed. "You look like your mother," he said quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion he was trying to suppress. "But you have my chin. You're going to be stubborn like me." Sofia studied him with the same careful attention she gave to new horses at the therapeutic center, assessing his temperament and intentions with an intuition that impressed the counselors present. "I'm stubborn when I need to protect something," she replied, her voice clear and confident. "Moonlight taught me that sometimes you have to be strong for others who can't be strong for themselves." The mention of Moonlight visibly affected Richard, who had spent years trying not to think about the horse whose actions had exposed his crime. "How is she?" he asked, surprising everyone including himself with the question. "She's old now, but she still takes care of children who have been hurt," Sofia replied. "She remembers that night in the forest. Sometimes when I'm brushing her, I can tell she's thinking about it. She's proud of what she did." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Sofia asking direct questions about Richard's motivations and feelings, while he struggled to provide answers that were both honest and age-appropriate. The meeting seemed to have a profound effect on both of them, with Sofia gaining a more complete understanding of her origins and Richard finally confronting the full human cost of his actions. "I made the worst possible choice," Richard finally admitted, tears flowing down his cheeks for the first time since his arrest. "I was so afraid of losing everything that I was willing to sacrifice everything that actually mattered. I'm sorry, Sofia. I know that's not enough, but I'm sorrier than I've ever been about anything in my life." Sofia listened to his apology with the same careful attention she had shown throughout their conversation, then reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because what you did was okay, but because Moonlight taught me that holding on to anger just makes you tired. She never stayed angry at the coyotes who wanted to hurt me. She just focused on keeping me safe." The visit ended with Richard asking if he could write to Sofia occasionally, not to seek forgiveness or to build a relationship, but simply to know how she was doing as she grew up. Sofia agreed, with the understanding that Marina would read all correspondence first, and that contact would continue only as long as it was beneficial for Sofia's emotional development. The letters that followed were unlike anything Richard had written during his years in prison, focused entirely on Sofia's well-being and achievements, rather than his own situation or grievances. He wrote about his memories of Moonlight, sharing stories about the horse's intelligence and sensitivity that helped Sofia understand more about the animal who had saved her life. The correspondence seemed to provide Richard with a sense of purpose that had been missing from his incarceration, while giving Sofia additional insight into her complex family history. As Sofia entered adolescence, she began speaking publicly about her experiences, sharing her story at conferences about child welfare and animal-assisted therapy. Her presentations were remarkable for their maturity and insight, demonstrating how trauma could be transformed into wisdom through proper support and healing relationships. "I used to think I was different from other kids because of what happened to me," Sofia told an audience of social workers and child advocates. "But then I realized that lots of kids have adults who let them down. The difference is that I had Moonlight, and she showed me that protection and love can come from the most unexpected places. Now I try to be like Moonlight for other kids who need someone to stand guard over them." Sofia's speaking engagements, combined with her continued success in equestrian competition and her academic achievements, attracted attention from colleges and universities that wanted to recruit her for their board-in programs. She ultimately chose to study veterinary medicine with a focus on animal-assisted therapy, planning to dedicate her career to expanding understanding of how animals could help heal human trauma. The full-circle nature of Sofia's journey, from abandoned infant to advocate for vulnerable children, demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when supported by love and protection. Her story became a powerful example of how the worst human failures could be overcome through the intervention of unexpected heroes and the careful nurturing of healing relationships. Moonlight, now in her 20s and considered elderly for a horse, continued to work with selected children at the Therapeutic Riding Center, though her activities were limited to gentle interactions that accommodated her aging body. Her legacy lived on through the hundreds of children and families she had helped heal, and through the research and training programs that had been developed based on her unique therapeutic abilities. The old oak tree in the forest where Sofia had been found continued to serve as an unofficial memorial, visited by people from around the world who had been moved by the story of the abandoned baby and her unlikely protector. The site had become a place of pilgrimage for parents struggling with difficult decisions about their children, many of whom found inspiration and strength from the knowledge that love and protection could triumph over the darkest human impulses. As the years passed, and Sofia grew into young adulthood, the story of her rescue and recovery became a modern legend that inspired countless acts of kindness and protection toward vulnerable children and animals. The tale served as a reminder that heroism could come in any form, that moral courage was more valuable than wealth or status, and that the bonds between humans and animals could transcend the boundaries of species to create connections that literally saved lives and transformed destinies.